that again. So my name is Kurt Scheer. I am a program manager on the Virtual Machine Manager team. I'll be talking about services, service deployments, service templates, lots of services. So coming out of this session, these are kind of the things that you can take away from it. Learning how to build services, first of all. Understanding the managing applications with multiple tiers, using services. Updating services that have already been deployed, sort of the life cycle. All right. So first, when we're talking about services, the first thing I want to talk about is the abstraction of a service in general and kind of what that means. The components of a service template, the life cycle of a service, and then some advanced topics, although this is a 200-level course, so the term advanced is sort of relative. So first of all, abstractions. So you're all probably aware of VMM's cloud. They're a general abstraction. You've got your compute, your storage, your networking, all that, and you kind of abstract that away into a cloud. And then when deploying, the underlying hardware is kind of abstracted away. So the idea behind the service abstraction is to kind of remove your dependence on individual VMs. So although you're still managing VMs, you're kind of managing multiple VMs as a single entity. And it's a little bit of a different approach to administration as far as a lot of people are really familiar with dialing into a specific VM, logging in, setting everything up, and then doing that again a couple times. And anytime you have to add a node to a cluster or something like that, there's a lot of manual work involved. So this is kind of a different approach where all of that is more or less automated for you once you've told it how. And you can provide scalability where it's needed. Like I said, scaling up and down of a cluster, something like that. If you have multiple tiers, one SQL cluster, one web farm, and you need, say, more SQL, you could add another instance to the cluster fairly easily using services. So services in VMM, the first thing is the service template itself. It's kind of your starting point for deploying services in general. You're setting apart your requirement specifications, so you're saying the pieces you need and the pieces you'll expect to be there. And then whenever you go to actually deploy this, your templates get locked and they turn into an instance. The instances are tied to a specific template. VMs are attached to the service, and then applications can be deployed without VMs, but generally the service template gets locked on deployment, and that's one of the life cycle things I'll talk about. All right, on to the components of what a service template entails. So there's these basic building blocks. You've got your different profiles. You've got hardware, which you could probably think of the hardware portion kind of like the Hyper-V settings. So you go in there and you tell it, the number of processors, the amount of memory you're going to have, the disks, basically all the physical components of the machine. And then you've got your guest OS profile. This is going to be all of your settings as far as it pertains to computer names, domains, roles and features, things like that. And then you've got an application profile. This is where you're going to put in your scripts or your installations, like if you're installing SQL, if you're installing a web deploy package, something like that. Excuse me. And that's going to be all kind of contained within that application profile. And then a SQL Server profile. If you've done a sysprep of the VHD that you're installing, and the sysprep also contains a sysprepped SQL install, then there's some configuration you can do there to complete the sysprep install for SQL. And all of these make up a VM template. So I'm just going to pull up a demo here. Let's see. All right, my screen isn't incredibly high resolution here. So in your library in VMM, here are on the left here, we can see the pieces I was talking about there. I'm not sure this laser point is great. So the pieces I was talking about on the left here, you've got your different profiles. Starting with the hardware profile, I've created one here I called default hardware profile that maybe I'll use in all of my instance deployments. And so for the hardware profile, this is where I'll set processors, memory, things like this, all of the things you would imagine to set. Here I haven't defined any IDE devices because when I create a VM template, it's going to bind the guest VHD to the device there, so I've just left it without any devices. I could add a CD or something if I wanted to there. And this is where I've set my network that I have. So this is just kind of a general template that you can use, and I'll show how that ties in a little bit. I've specified high availability here. This means that if you're going to deploy this template, any VM that's running from this hardware profile can only be deployed to a clustered host. The reason I've done that is because if you deploy a VM to a clustered host but don't deploy it in highly available mode, it will, by default, it doesn't get put in the same place. It doesn't go to the CSV. It gets end up on the local storage for that machine or wherever you have it set up. And when you're doing that, you could quickly run out of space as I have before, so I've just set them to all be highly available. And that's pretty much it for the hardware profile. The guest OS profile, I've made a default guest OS profile here. And this is where you set your operating system type. You've got your computer name here. If you give it a star, the star is going to mean it's an auto generation, and it'll give you some kind of VM 001 or something like that. It'll kind of, it's a pseudo auto generated. If I wanted to give it a specific name, say this was Contoso and I wanted to give everything Contoso server number. These last two here where I've given a number, a string of hashtags will auto increment. So it'll use this prefix, and then the first deployment will be 01 and the next will be 02 and so forth. Down here is where you see the roles, just like you would expect, and then the features as well. Down here is where I list my domain that I'm going to join, and then here's the run as account I've specified that has the rights to add a computer account to the domain. And then on down here, if you wanted to provide an answer file or something like that, you could do that. And then the last component I'm going to be talking about is the application profiles. So when you create an application profile, it's essentially just an empty kind of resource here where you can add any of these pieces. And if you wanted to add a script here, this is where you say what it's going to run, parameters, and things like that. And I'll give some examples and a little bit of some more of those. So back to the building block pieces, that application profile I was showing you, it currently the only thing I showed you was to install scripts. But if you were to use either the web deploy component or the SQL DAC pack, their data application framework, then you can create a standalone application profile. And this would deploy using either web deploy or SQL's data application framework to a machine that's already existing. That means it could deploy to either a VM or an existing machine, provided that machine has either the web deploy or the SQL DAC pack utilities installed so that you can deploy. And there's some network issues that has to kind of be worked out there. That's all pretty well documented on how to get that kind of stuff set up. So here I have two that I've set. So when configuring this sort of thing, you've got your general, your SQL application host, and your web application host. If on this front page you choose, for example, web application host, then on this page the only things that you can add are web applications. And then this is a web application that I've built this zip file by exporting it using the web deploy tool. And then this was just added to my library. And the same thing goes for SQL, SQL's data application framework. You can use it to deploy, and on this front page here you choose SQL Server Application Host. And then on the next page, this is where you would choose the DAC pack that you already have in the library, and then give whatever credentials you need, whether it's Windows authentication or SQL authentication. And then you specify an uninstall mode for these, because if you were to delete this service, kind of the action to take. And that's pretty straightforward there. And you can add a couple extra options there, specify the specific instance name. And then on this page, you could add .SQL scripts to run after the database has been added. So it's a pretty thorough. You can do a lot, I guess. So back to the building blocks here. Each of these become a tier in the service template. So it's essentially this kind of drag and drop style of you take a VM template that you built, you take an application profile you've built, and you just kind of drag them into the service template. And then the other piece is the service configuration itself. This is things beyond just the tier, just drag and dropping the tiers. So you've got service settings that you can use. Service settings are kind of just like variables that you pass into a service, where you can basically parameterize what special things that need to be set at deployment time, whether they be general things where you need to know the name of a server or anything like that. The tier settings, you can set the count on a tier. As I mentioned before, the scaling in and scaling out of a tier is related to all the VMs in a tier are homogeneous, and if you scale out, it just creates another instance. So the tier settings kind of give you that ability to specify what you want the initial size of the tier to be, and how big you want it to be, how little you want it to be. Now, it's not a blocking setting. It'll give a warning for the service if you try to scale out past the value that you've set, but you could. And then the networking requirements is where you would specify if you had network load balancers or specific networks that you need to be connected to. That's where you would specify that information. So those are sort of the other pieces of the service template that aren't just held within the VM template or application profile. All right, and then now I'm going to move on to the life cycle, kind of what happens there. As far as life cycle management, it's a pretty straightforward process. The first thing you do is create the template, and then when you go to deploy the template becomes locked, and an instance of the service is created, but the instance itself is not deployed at that point. You have an opportunity to fill in the service settings and run placement to find out which host it needs to be on and things like that. So that phase I'll refer to as customized deployment. And then once you finish customizing deployment, you kind of sign off to it. It goes ahead and deploys. And once the deployment is completed, you end up with a service instance. And in order to make any changes to the service instance, you have to update the template. You have to make a new version of the template and update it, and then apply that new version to the existing service instance, and then it will redeploy the service instance to have essentially a new version of the service instance. So creation being the first step. So there's a couple tools for creation. You've got your designer that's all in the UI, and then you've got PowerShell. I won't be dealing a lot with the PowerShell in this session. I'm just kind of getting a general overview of it. I'll get into it a little bit at the end. But generally, you can take, whether you're linking them from within the PowerShell or whether you're drag and dropping, you take your VM template and your application profile you've made and kind of drop them into the tools, and that's how you end up with a service template. So let me run through a actual creation here. All right, I have no VM templates, so I will make a VM template. And the first thing it's going to ask me is either for an existing VM template or a virtual hard disk that I need to provide. The virtual hard disk, I've already run sysprep on it and placed it in my library. It's a 2012 image, so I'm going to choose that VHD file. And that's convenient. Yeah, this has already been sysprepped prior to putting it in the library. The VMM expects a sysprepped image. What's that? Yeah. There we go. So I'm going to give this a name. It's a very unoriginal VM template name. Now here on each of these pages is where you're going to get your profiles that I showed you earlier. So here I could either set one up or I could just choose the one I had preset before, and I'll do that. And then anything that it's here, you'll see that it's updated the VHD, where previously I had no IDE devices there, and all the other settings just come through. And then the next thing I'm going to do is the operating system configuration. So from here, I choose the same operating system profile I had before, and I could update any of these if I want. And then for application configuration, I'm just going to choose no applications. And just to show this, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to specify the admin account. And for the select, I'm going to choose to select an existing run as account. And I'm going to do this with a configurable service setting. So by wrapping this term in @signs, it turns this into a service setting. And then when we go to deploy it, I can parameterize this. So we'll just go ahead and finish this. So the question was, earlier I had changed the computer name in the profile, and then now it's not showing up. I actually didn't save those changes, and it's the reason it didn't show up here. So now I have the VM template created, and I can make a new service template, and I can call this something like demo. I'll give it a release number. And I'm going to choose a blank. You can also choose one of these optional versions, and it essentially puts the tier there for you, and you can edit what it already has rather than doing this drag and drop. So this is usually easier to see with a higher resolution. But it's essentially a visual layout of the network and the different tiers and components. So if I want to deploy this, you'll see all the changes here kind of got propagated through, and then if I bring this back up, when I click on a tier, here are the tier settings where I could choose to allow this tier to be scaled out, and then I could say how many initial I want to deploy. Say if I wanted 3 instances of this, I could have 3, and then if I wanted to define where it gives warnings for minimum, maximum instance count, that's what I would do here. And then for an availability set, I could click this and say, this will basically attempt to deploy the hosts as a best effort to distribute them as much as possible, where you don't want the same VMs on the same host. Now, the caveat of that is, of course, if I say I've only got 2 hosts and I say I want 3 instances of this tier, it can't spread it out. So in cases like that, you'll get a warning, but it'll still deploy. So I'm going to change. Deployment can be, this system that I'm working on is a bit slow. So I'm going to change the deployment settings to deploy an empty file, essentially. Oops. So this is actually just a blank file. It's an unformatted disk. And I'm doing this for the purpose of just kind of showing what the deployment looks like, because it's a very small file. If I were to do a full deployment, it takes 20 or 30 minutes just because of the speed of my network in this lab that I'm using, so I don't want to deploy and then wait. So we're going to name this service deployment, and I'm going to call it anti-affinity, just to show that this availability set. So now that I've said configure deployment, this essentially, it created a service instance, but it's undeployed right now. And essentially, this is where it's showing kind of the configuration. So this, up here, I can run placement, and it will choose the host to deploy it to. And you can see it's Hyper-V 11 and Hyper-V 12. Those are the only hosts I have. And then here, where I had specified the run as account with a service setting, I now click it, and I can choose my run as account. So I'll let that run and jump back to the presentation here. Okay, now I talked about customized deployment. This is where you choose which host group you're going to deploy it to, or you can choose a cloud. I didn't have any clouds in my setting there, so I didn't do anything there. And then you specify your service settings. That's where I had put in the run as account that I had parameterized. You run placement. That's where you hit the refresh to let it run the placement. And you can optionally force settings. I guess I missed doing that, but just to show that real quick, this failed as I actually thought it would at the last minute, because that's actually a good. So a failed deployment will still have a service instance bound to it. This means that because this instance still exists, I won't be able to update the template. So I'm going to delete this instance. And then I can jump back to the library and edit this template. What had happened was I had told it to configure the operating system, but the disk that I provided had no operating system. So I'm just going to open the designer back up and change the properties here. The OS configuration, let's see. Here, I might not be able to set it. So I'm going to make another VM real quick. And this template is what I'll use to deploy. I'll use the blank disk. Now I'm going to use the same hardware profile, but this time when I get to the operating system profile, I'm actually going to tell it not to configure the operating system at all. So now coming back to the service template, I'm going to change the settings for the tier as I did before. Now I don't have any service settings this time, so I'm going to refresh. Now one thing I can do here, I mentioned about forcing settings. If I click on this, it's been set to a host here. If I select, I could choose a different host. Now the problem here is it warns me that by selecting this host, I'm going to end up putting two VMs on the same host that have been marked for anti-affinity. So you notice now it's pinned here. So I'm actually not. So I'm going to remove that pin and run placement again. All right. Now back to here. There it goes. Okay, now talking about the deployment process. I tried to represent this visually. It's kind of a difficult process to explain visually. But we've got these columns here. And what I've tried to indicate is at each step, the service step or the host step or the guest, basically per service, the things in that column are going to happen per host and then per guest, etc. So for each service deployed, it's going to select the tier. It's going to select the first tier based on the deployment order. Now you can set, if you had multiple tiers, you can set which tier should be deployed in a specific order if you needed to. For some reason, one tier needed to be up before the other or something like that. Then once it selects the tier, it's going to create the new VM for that host, and then it's going to kind of power on the VM and wait. Now at this point, it needs to connect, and it does this installation of the guest agent, and it does that on the guest, and then any pre-installation things that you have set. So if you're setting something, if you've added an application profile and you've set pre-install scripts to run, at this point all of those scripts will run. And then once those have run, then the application pre-install scripts will run. So any application can also have scripts with it. If you mark those scripts as pre-installed, then they will install after the pre-install scripts for the application, but before the application. And then it installs the application itself, runs the post-install application scripts, and then the post-install scripts. And then from there, it's going to add it to the load balancer if you've got that defined for that guest, and then you're done with that service. So talking about specific service instances, when we look at, I'll show in a moment, when we look in the VMs and services pane, the services show which VMs they have attached to them. And the tiers, each tier will show up in there, and the tiers can be scaled up or scaled down. And then the actions can be performed on the tiers or the VMs or the service or anything like that. So let me bring this back up here. Now, this time the creation of the service instance succeeded. And then I'm going to jump back here in the VM and services pane, we see here's the service that I just deployed, and it's been spread out among the hosts. So here's the tier, and it's got the two. There we go. It's got the two services, and see those names there are kind of pseudo randomish. They're kind of generated there, and then we can perform applications on this specific VM or perform applications on this tier. Now, if I attempt to scale out this tier, it warns me here that there's a maximum size for this tier that I've set, and I can continue to scale it out. So the warning there is just to kind of let you know someone in the service template originally set this to have a maximum of 2 instances, and now I'm trying to expand it beyond that. All right. Jump back here. All right, now I'm going to talk about updating the template. First, you make a copy or change the version. You need to basically create another template that is a copy of the template, since the template is bound to the instance, as I mentioned before. So there is, when you're looking in the library, there's this option called copy and update. What this will do is if you've made changes to any of the resources that this template relies on, if the library has had an updated resource added that it depends on, then when you choose this copy and update option, it will automatically take those new resources. And then you can make changes to the template there. And then I'll jump to the next step before I show applying the updates. And this is when you show, you would associate the new service, associate the new template with the service, and then you apply the update, and it'll get those changes. So I'm going to jump. There it is. So back here, I'm going to jump back to the library here. And I'm going to make a copy of this template. And I'm going to update it in the designer. I can change it to something useful, change its version to say 2. And then the other thing I'm going to change here is I'm going to raise the maximum instance count. Now coming back in VMs and services, here's a service here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on it, and I'm going to say set template. And from here, I'm going to choose to replace with this new version. Now it catches the changes, and it's going to show me all the updates it's going to do. Now notice over here, the template version number still says 1. That's because I haven't actually applied any of these changes yet. So now I'm going to right click on it, and I'm going to be able to apply template. And then it updates. Now if I try to scale out, I think I may need to, I think the scaling in, scaling out might not update here. I'm not positive on that. But if I had other changes that were more interesting, they'd generally be reapplied to the tier. So let me jump back here. All right, now the advanced topics that I wanted to talk about. The first one is custom properties. I think this is one of the things that a lot of people never get a chance to really see in action, but they're one of the one of the more useful, underutilized things. It's a way to provide additional information. They're completely customizable. And generally, the way you can do this in the GUI, but populating these options, populating these properties with PowerShell is probably the way to go. And I'm going to show a quick example of kind of what that looks like. So jumping back to the library, let's see. I have this template here that I've deployed called IIS. As you might suspect, it's an IIS server. And now you see up here we've got status, name, computer name, host, that kind of thing. So I'm going to jump back here. And there are different ways to set this. So for example, this VM, let's see, in the service template, say if I want to bring up the designer, bring up the properties for this specific tier. And then there's a section here called custom properties. Now the custom properties here, I could type in values and then they'll appear as columns that you can show once it's deployed, it'll appear as columns. And then if I manage custom properties, I could create new values because the terms like custom 1, custom 2, custom 3 don't give a whole lot of information. So I could create my own names here and then apply it to a special thing. So what I'm going to do first to kind of illustrate this, VMs and services, to bring up the properties of the IIS server. I'm going to manage custom properties. I'm going to add a new value called IP to the virtual machine. Now I could type it in here, but what I'm going to do is bring up a PowerShell here. And this is essentially a very straightforward script that just, it gets all the VMs that are currently deployed, it gets their IP address, it sets their IP address, and then whichever network I have them connected to, it sets that setting. And for that setting, here I used custom 1 to show the current connected network adapter. Custom 1 is one of the built-in properties. And then the property I just created called IP, that I get it down here, I get the property here, and then I set the custom property down here by providing the property and the value that I'm giving it along with the VM object. So I'm going to run this and then jump back to here. Now the columns at the top, because I set custom 1, I'm going to set that, and you'll see it's populated with the name of the network. And then I'm also going to add the IP property. And for whatever reason, this one didn't get its IP, which makes sense because it doesn't have an operating system. I'm not actually sure why that one did. But you can see up here, this is the IP address for this specific IIS server. So, I'm sorry? Yeah, I'm not sure what happened there. I would have to troubleshoot. You can. I can show how to do that. It's basically the question was, can you create a service template without the use of a VM template? So when you create a new service template, there's a couple options here. And if I chose, say, a single machine tier here, then when it makes this template, it's going to have a machined here. And then when I can bring up the properties, I can set any of these. I can set any of the properties here. And that's how I would have done it before. Now, an important thing to note is if I take a VM template here and I were to add this VM template to this service, this template is not actually tied to this VM template. All of the values are copied, but if I then proceed to change the VM template, it's not going to propagate the changes to the service template. They're all just copied by value. That's correct. The question was, can you delete the VM template after moving it into a service template? And it's true, you can. And it's very possible that I used a template for the IIS service template and then deleted the VM template originally. All right, another one of the questions that comes up pretty often is dealing with domains. One of the first things we try to warn people again is not to try deploying VMs to any OU that has a very complicated group policy. If it's getting deployed to an OU that has a complicated group policy, what will end up happening is sometimes the group policy can do things like installing applications or whatever have you that will interfere with VMM trying to also do things at the same time. So as a sort of just a general rule, we try to say, if you've got really complicated GPOs, try to avoid deploying VMs to that OU. But if you've spent any time in VMM just using the UI, you'll find that there's not actually a way to specify the OU to deploy it to if you were to create a special OU for your VMs. So now you could do some things with answer files, but I'm going to try to show kind of a better way to script those kind of settings here. So I'm going to create a VM template. And I'm going to call this template domain. I'm just going to choose the default hardware profile I have. I'm going to choose the default guest OS profile that I have, and this default profile down here has it set to join the domain, contoso.com, with the domain admin credentials. I'm not going to do any further customization after that. So now I've created this template, and I'm going to try and use a combination of a few things here. First, I'm going to bring it up, and I'm going to manage its custom properties. I'm going to add the OU property. Here in the dropdown, I'm adding the OU property to the virtual machine template object. So all virtual machine templates will now have this OU property. So I'm going to add this. That's not what I meant to do. Okay, you notice the actual OU property has nothing there. Actually, let me remove that release. So it's an empty field right now. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up a PowerShell commandlet. And what this does is, here is the LDAP string for the OU container that I want to deploy this VM to. This is the name of the template that I just created, domain. So I'm going to get the template that matches that name, and then I'm going to this this property here, domain join organizational unit, is a property of the VM template, but it's just not exposed to the UI. So I'm going to set this domain, set the domain OU setting, and then because once I do that, I would have no way to then see that I've done that. I also get that custom property that I just made OU, and I set the custom property to be that. So now if I run this, and we come back here, you can see the actual OU setting is then set here. And that's a nice way to see it in the VM template in the library, and also kind of have to set what you need there. I see. So the question is, can you get that information then from an existing VM template? Oh, I see. So that would involve actually talking to the domain controller to figure out which OU it's in. That's not what I'm doing here. I mean, I guess you could do some kind of thing like that. I mean, if you're in the PowerShell already, I'm sure you could get that information and then set it. But all I've done here is set a setting for the VM template so that when it deploys, it'll join that OU. All right, clustering is one that comes up a couple times. So in a clustered environment, your first node has to build the cluster, and then subsequent nodes have to join the cluster. And the way to kind of do this is basically to use different tiers for the different nodes. So your first node that comes up will be its own tier, and then all of the other nodes that come up will be a different tier. And your secondary tier can be scaled in and scaled out, and all they have to do is join the cluster. And then you can do that with deployment order, setting the deployment order of the first tier to be 1, and then the subsequent tier to be 2. That way, when you deploy the service template, you know that the cluster will be created prior to the other nodes joining the cluster. And that helps with when you're scaling in and out. You can just scale the resting tier in and out. Now, scaling the first tier out wouldn't really be a good thing to do. So I'm just going to bring up a sample template I have here. So this is called 4-node cluster because it's a 4-node cluster. And it's got 2 tiers here. And then the first tier So essentially, the first tier has got these scripts that it runs. And I'm using iSCSI to do the clustering. And I would pass in the FQDN of the SCSI target. And the SCSI target would have already been set to approve these VMs that I'm deploying. And you could do that just by using the name of the, because all of the Microsoft iSCSI initiators have the same ID. So you'd be able to use that, and just with the last part of the ID being the name of the computer. So you'd be able to set that. And then the second cluster the second script actually builds the cluster. So then on the second tier, it's a very kind of similar thing. The first script also connects to the iSCSI target. This one is called REST instead of first because it had you get the first tier and then the rest of the tiers. And then here's another REST where these will just join. And you'll see this custom resource package I have is clustersetup.cr. Now custom resources, now that I've gotten to that point, so if we look at the library share, so here's the library share on the local machine. I have all these folders, and any folder name that I have ended with a .cr, VMM will see as a custom resource. So within that custom resource, I can put whatever scripts I want. And that's how, when they're deployed, this custom resource folder will be sent as a payload over to the machine, and then it will run these scripts, whatever's in the payload. So the first script was just a CMD script, and it essentially sets the execution policy and calls the PowerShell script, passing in all the arguments it received. I don't know why it's starting with another one. And then you can see here, all I have to do for the first one is essentially getting all the disks. And then for each of the disks, it just essentially numbers them. And then, I mean, this is all just like the scripted cluster setup. So I'm doing everything to set cluster quorum. These are all just the Windows failover cluster PowerShell commandlets that I'm calling to set up the cluster. And then once all that's done, I run the test validation. And then the rest is significantly less complicated because all they have to do at that point is just join that existing cluster. So get cluster name, add cluster node, and that's pretty much all they have to do. So with that, I could deploy this and get a 4-node cluster, and then I could scale in and scale out these nodes. Unfortunately, it takes 30 to 45 minutes to deploy on my system, so I won't be able to show it. So, and then the other one we get asked a lot is about using Linux with services. So a couple points here. First of all, the OS image must have Hyper-V additions and the VMM guest agent pre-installed. So because you don't have to do a lot of you don't have to run sysprep on a Linux machine. There's no kind of generalization necessary. So you can basically build everything, get the machine running, have all its payloads, run any kind of updates you want to, and then just shut the machine down. Then you could just take that VHD and drop it into your library as your sort of base Linux install image. There's no custom resources available with Linux. The payloads have to be baked into the disk file, but there are run1 scripts to install after it boots. So I'm going to show what I have here is a Linux cluster distributed file system. Oops. I'm going to bring up this here. And it's actually very similar to the Windows failover cluster scenario, where you've got a first versus rest. And then what I do here so on the OS configuration page, when you choose the operating system, I've chosen Linux, I've chosen Ubuntu 12.04. It's a supported version. That version actually has the Hyper-V guest additions in the image. The kernel mods are already there. So you just have to essentially install the VMM guest additions, and then you're ready to use that image. So here I've set Linux DFS ## to be the computer name, and then the DNS domain name I've set as a service setting so that you can add in the suffix, and this would be Linux DFS ##domain suffix. And then the run as account, that's something you have to worry about, is that here I've actually made the Linux root run as account, and it has the username root with the actual root password, and it's saved encrypted with the run as account, so that the machine can actually log into it. Because it's not a generalized type of install, it can't use answer files or anything like that. It has to have root passwords to be able to log into the machine post deployment. And then here, all I've done is I've basically written a shell script that will bring up the cluster. I just used an open source package. React is available. It's just a distributed file system. It's a key value pair type of system. So I've set that there, and then it'll be passed in. And if you wanted to do something, for instance, if you needed to set some kind of thing, you could do some kind of, whatever kind of sed command you need to do there. For instance, if you had some kind of setting here, and then you needed to change that to some other setting, and then, whatever etc hosts or something like that. And then so you could add that and set it, so you could do that kind of thing to replace or add or whatever. And that's all going to be, those are all going to be executed once it deploys. So probably the easiest thing to do what I've done here is basically write a shell script, keep it on the machine, and then you could just run that shell script rather than trying to pass through all the commands individually. It makes troubleshooting significantly easier. So originally there was supposed to be another person presenting. We were going to have a customer speak, but they ended up not coming. So that is the end of my portion. So if there are questions, I'd be happy to answer. So the reason I do that is because you get a lot of instances where the PowerShell won't run. Trying to run it directly PowerShell.exe and then the name of the PowerShell. Maybe there's script execution policies or permission issues. So I created a command file that will just set the execution policy first thing and then call the script. And it's kind of a more straightforward way to do that. One of the other things that I did with that deployment is specifically if you've got a tier that you're supposed to be, let's see, application here where the commands are running, there's an advanced pane here, and on the advanced pane I've set standard input and standard error. And that's kind of an invaluable thing for troubleshooting is it'll just redirect all output to these two files. So if a deployment fails for some reason, you can come back in here and connect to the machine and check those log files. Oops. What was the question about CRs? No. So all of the payloads for the Unix systems would have to be already in the image. Now, the other thing about that is that if you're using one of the portage packages, one of the supported distributions like CentOS or Debian, the Ubuntu 12.04, in those sorts of instances, you have package managers, and you could run those package manager scripts as custom scripts, apt-get install, whatever. And that might be the way to go about doing a lot of those types of things.
On the 4-node cluster,
Mm-hmm.
do you have any comments about the best way to get SQL Server into that configuration? Because SQL Server is a little convoluted when it comes to the cluster.
So probably the easiest thing to do is install. So you wouldn't be able to sysprep. SQL doesn't support a sysprepped cluster install. So what you'd have to do is you'd have to get the SQL image, get that payload and the install files, and probably the thing to do might be to just put it directly on that drive and have a Server 2012 sysprep with SQL install VHD. So C/SQL is the actual install file, and then when you run a SQL install, you go through and you get to the very last tab. Before you choose to actually go through the install, on the bottom it puts out a file there that's an XML file that is all the settings you just defined. So then you can take that XML file and then put that in a custom resource. So then what you can do is call the SQL install and just providing that XML file, and you can do that. And in an instance like installing SQL to a failover cluster, If you've got multiple instances of SQL you're installing, that's a consideration that you have to do, because all of the SQL instances will have to be installed on the first node in the cluster, and then after it's done, you'll probably have to manually fail over the different instances to try and spread the load. So, sure. Yeah.
Are you going to be sharing your scripts that you have?
Yeah, I can absolutely share all of these. I'm not sure how. I can put up a blog post or something like that. I'm not sure. This is my first time speaking in an MMS, so I don't know how they follow up with scripts and things like that.
What would the logic be in terms of whether you use a template for a single VM deployment versus one VM service?
So if it is an instance where you actually just need one VM and you know that you're only going to ever use one VM, a VM deployment might be the way to go. The thing about services is when you've got a service deployed, you can scale in and you can scale out and you can manage everything as a single entity. But if your single entity is only a single VM, there's not a whole lot of advantage to doing that. And a lot of times, if you have a single VM and you don't want somebody to scale that VM out, putting in a service template might not be the thing you want to do. It might be the opposite of the thing you want to do. Sure. Yeah. Yeah, so that's one thing I didn't show is the import and export of a template. So essentially, say for instance, this 4-node cluster, what I would do is export. When I choose to export, the physical resources that are associated with this, all of the custom resources I built, and the VHD file also. Of course, there's licensing issues with distributing that, but you could export all of these, and what it'll do is when you specify the location, say desktop for instance, it creates an XML file and then also creates a folder where all of those custom resources are, a resource folder. Usually doesn't take very long. So here is the, let's see. Yeah, so there's a custom resources there. I don't actually see the, there it is. And there's the XML file. Now, in the opposite direction, if you were given these custom resources and the XML file, what you would first need to do is take those custom resources and drop them in your library. You have to have that there first, refresh your library, and then when you come up here on the home part of the ribbon, when you import a template, browse. So I can import this. It's going to take that XML file and it's going to scan it and look for custom resources, VHDs, anything like that. And then here, now these were already in my library, so it actually just reassociated all of them. And that's probably the most straightforward, easy way to do it. And then the same with the run as accounts. Anything for example, if I didn't have a matching run as account, it would just show that it needed it. So then I would click on the little pencil there and I would select the run as account and all of that. And then once it's done that, it's just going to take, I'm going to name it something else so it doesn't overwrite. And I'll do the import and it'll just reassociate that because all of the custom resources are, they're objects that have their different unique identifiers and things like that. It has to link those during the import. So let's see. Here it is down here, and that's pretty much the import-export process. It's pretty straightforward.
What about automating the zoning and masking for VMs, virtualized VAs?
I'm not sure. So I haven't done a lot with storage, and I'm not sure how you would do that in an automated way from within a service template. And that might be the kind of place where you would have all of it, everything set up in your fabric as far as the storage goes, and then you would have to do, you might have to use PowerShell to create templates in that regard. If you want to talk with me afterwards, I can get you in contact with someone who does more of that storage size. I'm sorry, could you speak up?
Let's say you have a profile, gas profile, and hardware profile,
Uh-huh.
and you want to, before you deploy, you want to patch it, right? Because if this is VM sitting for 3 months or 4 months,
Oh, I see. So you want to patch the VHT prior to deployment?
is there a way that, or you can do something constantly doing it without paying the VM?
Not from within the UI. You would have to. I mean, I guess the best way to do that would be, the manual way, of course, to boot up the VM and then run it and then sysprep again. I'm not sure there's an automated way to do that. I know you can install features to a VHD, but I'm not sure if you can install patches.
So then it gets into a template management issue, and at that point you're best off looking at something like template manager, tasks sequence before failure template, and you catch that.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of intersection of the other products in System Center that could definitely help with something like that.
SCCM can go connect there,
Yeah.
so I don't know how good version managing
Oh, I don't have any of the integration components installed on this VMM instance.
because the VHD is always scaled, right?
Kind of like PowerShell script.
Yeah.
We'll wait for the blog then.
Sure.
So if you've got an existing service instance that has a tier with multiple nodes in it,
Okay.
decide that you'd rather scale up than scale out. Maybe just your original template didn't have adequate resources. Can you modify the hardware profile, and when you apply that, will the existing nodes recognize it initially?
It depends. So sometimes, I guess, is the right answer for that. So generally, a lot of the things, like if you're changing memory and things like that, a lot of times they can catch the settings. Of course, those are settings that can't be changed while the machine is running. So it would have to do, rolling restarts and things like that of everything. Some of the things you can't change. You can't change the VHD that's deployed on the system and things like that. So as a general case, you can change some of the hardware settings and apply the template, and then sometimes they'll get all of it depending on the setting. I don't know the specifics of everything that does and doesn't work.
Well, processor memory would typically be the low input, right? In most cases, care about.
Yeah. Most of the other stuff doesn't usually propagate in my experience. All right. Well, if there are no more questions, thanks for coming. Have a good week.